I think I did it again, didn't I? Oh my good. Okay, so that's the second time in a row that I have forgotten to put my microphone on. It's quite embarrassing. I've got no words other than sorry. Hopefully it's coming through now. Yeah, it did. Great. Okay, let me start that again. So I just wanted to welcome everyone along to tonight's stream, which is my third stream. The first two streams were focused on Chocolatey and how you can do certain things within Chocolatey and its ecosystem. Tonight's stream is slightly different in the sense that it's going to be focused on another project that I work on, which is the Cake project. Specifically, this stream is going to be about Cake.Recipe, which is a set of opinionated scripts that I created because I found that I was doing the same thing over and over and over again when it came to building Cake add-ins, which is what we're going to talk about tonight. So rather than having the same build script repeated across multiple projects and repositories, I ended up creating a set of scripts that could be reused across those repositories instead, right? So what's showing in the screen above me at the minute is where you can find Cake.Recipe. So Cake.Recipe is a project on GitHub, which ultimately is produced as a NuGet package. So if we go to nuget.org and search for Cake.Recipe, we will find it there, right? So that's where you can consume it from. Although most people consume it at the minute from myget.org. So myget.org, for those of you who don't know, is a NuGet equivalent, normally used when you want to push a pre-release version of something, or nightly builds or something along those lines. So Cake.Recipe at the minute on nuget.org is only at version 2.2. That was published a long time ago now, and since then a lot of iteration and a lot of refactoring work has went into what Cake.Recipe is just now in its 0.3 version, and the pre-release version of that is available on MyGet, and we'll discuss how we can get that in a bit. So Cake.Recipe, as I said, is a set of scripts. It's a set of scripts that are bundled into a NuGet package, and they contain all of the custom logic, all of the reusable code that I found myself always needing to do when I was doing Cake add-ins. So what am I talking about? What I'm talking about there are things like compiling code, generating a NuGet package, taking that NuGet package and pushing it to MyGet, taking that NuGet package and pushing it to nuget.org, running code analysis, running code coverage once I do my unit tests. What else? We would want to assert a version number that we want to stamp onto all of the assemblies. All of these things I had to do again and again. So rather than do it multiple times in multiple repositories, I do it in one place, maintain it in one place, and then reuse it across multiple projects. So where that's gotten us today is Cake.Recipe is being used on a number of Cake add-ins that live under the Cake contrib repository organization on GitHub. So in there, there's something like over 100 repositories with various add-ins for different things, and I'd like to say that a high percentage of those are using Cake.Recipe for doing those builds. Now, the reason that that's a good thing is it means that the whole premise of the Cake contrib organization is such that any contributor to Cake contrib should be able to walk up to a project and build it and deploy it. So by having the same build infrastructure for all of those add-ins, it makes it much easier to walk up to a project that you're maybe not familiar with, but you know how the build works. So that's what we want to do, right? We want to have it in a way that multiple people can use it in the same way, right? So what are we doing here tonight? Tonight, we are here to talk about how to implement Cake.Recipe on a new project. So that new project that I want to talk about is this one. So I've created, at the minute, it's living as a private repository in my GitHub account. I want to move that out into the Cake contrib organization. But what this thing is a Cake add-in that wraps a small utility application that I pretty much always install on any machine that I walk up to. And it's a project called the Dotnet version detector. And all it does is it detects the versions of .NET that are installed on any given machine, right? It's a really simple application, but it's entirely useful when you are trying to figure out why something isn't working. And rather than having to dig into registry keys and digging through the file system to find out what .NET versions are installed on your machine, you can just run this tool. So to show you that in action, if I come up to here and run .NET versions as a command, what we end up with is this utility tool pops up and it tells me that I have .NET Framework 4.7.2 installed on this machine. Okay, if any of these other frameworks were installed, they would be lit up, or if any of these frameworks were installed specifically, they would light up to indicate that they were installed. But for me, I've just got those ones installed. So this utility has some command line syntax that actually exports that information into a text file or into an XML file that can be placed onto the file system. So the first pass of this Cake add-in is to do just that, to export those files and put them onto the file system ready for consumption. Now, a subsequent release of the Cake .NET version detector add-in will most likely deserialize that XML file into a class that then can then be consumed within your actual Cake script. But the first pass is just to generate that. So what I've done to date is I've created a basic folder structure that has the project in it. So this is where the actual Cake code lives for exercising that utility tool. I'm not planning on digging into the code of what it does. You can look at that later. It has a test project, so I run some unit tests to make sure that everything's working as I expect it to. And I've got some kind of top level files here for Git attributes and Git ignore, just to kind of set the repository up the way I want it to. So to show that in action, if I walk up to here and run a .NET build, just to prove that everything's working, locally I can run .NET build on the solution, which is just Cake.NET version detector solution, and I can prove that this add-in in its current state works, which it does. There's a couple of warnings for some things that I didn't get the chance to figure out and make them go away, but for now the project itself runs. And if I go and do a .NET test on the source Cake tests project, which is in here and in there, I think I've got something like 10 tests ready to run. So I've got 10 tests and they're all passing. So it's I'm at a point locally where I want to start building a CI system so that I can know that everything is working the way I want it to. If I go one step further just to prove it all out, let's go into the folder structure here and go into source. There's one that I prepared earlier, so let me just delete that. If I go into the source folder and then I go into the Cake.NET version detector folder, then in there I've got a sample.cake file that exercises the add-in that I want to test to make sure it's working the way I want it to. So I've also got the Cake.tool installed globally, so I can run Cake directly without needing to do anything else. So just for the sake of testing and making sure that everything's working, I'm going to run Cake on that .cake file, and what we should see is that an output.txt file and an output.xml file has been generated. So what we're seeing there is the output from the command line version of the .NET version detector tool, and what we have is these are all the things that I have available on my machine in text format, and it's also available in an XML file format. So as far as I'm concerned, the add-in as it currently stands works. It's doing what I expect it to. And now, like I say, I'm at the point where I want to start adding the CI/CD pipeline to build it and deploy it and make sure that everything's working the way I want it to. So if we open up that folder structure again, just to get rid of those two files that were generated, because we don't actually want them just now. So that was in here. Delete those two. So what we need to do is we need to start building this. We need to start building it somewhere. So Cake.Recipe, in its current incarnation, I think it's fair to say that it works best on Appveyor as a CI platform. It can run on other CI platforms, Azure DevOps, Travis. I've run it on a few places, but when it first started, Appveyor was kind of the de facto standard for doing builds on Windows for .NET. That you could argue that's maybe slightly changing, but I still use Appveyor as my go-to CI platform. It's the one that I know the best, and it's the one that I've had the most experience with. So to get started, what we want to do first, as I mentioned, I can close this one out. The .NET version Detector repository currently lives in a private repository on my GitHub repository. So what I want to do is I want to move it into the Cake contrib organization because that's where I want it to ultimately live. So let's just go into settings here in GitHub. First thing I'll do is I'll make this public, just so that it. That's ultimately how it's going to be used. So let's just make it public just now. And then what I want to do is I want to transfer this repository into Cake contrib. Type the name of the repository. That's the wrong thing I'm typing in there. Cake.net. Let's try typing properly. .NET version Detector. I chose the most long-winded project to do all of this with, but let's run with it now. And I'm going to move it into the Cake contrib organization. So if I go ahead and say, I understand, and what I'll do, so this is just GitHub asking me what teams within that organization I want to associate with it. So I'm going to just pick the main team, which is that one, and I'm going to say transfer. So once that's done, if I close that out and go back over here, we should now hopefully have a new repository in here that is the Cake.net version Detector, which is here. Perfect. Right. So now we have everything set up and in the place that we want it to be. So now that we have that, a couple of the conventions that I apply to a repository in terms of my CI/CD pipeline is some people either love it or hate it. I personally think it's a very usable branching strategy. I tend to always use Git flow. So my repositories always have two main branches, which are the master branch and the develop branch. And that's what I've been developing on locally. So I've been using the develop branch locally to do all of the source code commits. And then ultimately, when I'm ready to publish that add-in to NuGet, I'll be merging everything into the master branch, ready for letting everyone else have it. So there's a couple of things in GitHub that we want to change over now that I've actually put this live. The first one being that I want to set the develop branch to be the default branch. I'm just going to go ahead and update that. And now if we jump back to this main repository, we should see the source code that I've got locally because I've already pushed it up. And there's a couple of other settings that we can dig into later, but that would be around the protecting of the branches in terms of not allowing merging under certain cases when the CIs kick in, that sort of thing. We'll come back to that. Okay. So for now, I've now got my repository what I want it to be. What I need to do now is I need to reclone this repository locally, because at the minute I've got GitHub repository clone locally that is targeting the private repository that was in my profile. So I'm going to change that slightly. So what I tend to do is I tend to have a top level GitHub folder that has my profile, which is Git13, and then it has another one that is organizations. So I'm going to keep that folder structure the same. So I'm now going to create another folder in the organizations folder. So organizations is here. Let's just go ahead and create a directory called Cake.Contrib and then cd into that. And then I'm going to do a git clone of that repository. Actually, no, I'm not. I've got ahead of myself a little bit. What I almost always do is I will fork that repository because for one reason or another, I almost always do work on a fork and send PRs from my fork into the main repository. It just keeps things a little bit cleaner. It also reduces the amount of CI churn that happens as a result of pushing branches into the main repository and also the fork. So I'm going to clone the fork repository locally first. So I'm going to do a git clone of my fork of that project, and then I'm going to set an additional remote to point at where I want any changes to go into. So that fork is over here, which is this one. And if I go ahead and go back to the command line and cd into the Cake.Dotnet version detector. So currently, from a Git remote perspective, I've only got the one, which is origin. Let's just do it with -v so we can see everything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a Git Remote Add, and I'm going to add a new one, which I refer to as the upstream. So the upstream repository is where that fork comes from. That's the kind of naming convention that I've always adopted. And there we go. So now if I do a Git Remote -v, we should see that I've got an origin and I've got an upstream. Right. So in terms of my Git and my GitHub setup, I'm now good to go. Now we need to start thinking about CI, continuous integration. We want something to build every commit that's put into this repository in a way that we can then verify that the tests are still working, the build is still passing, and everything like that. So as I mentioned, my default when I'm doing things like this is to use Appveyor. So that's over here. So currently, as you'll see, over here on Appveyor, under the Cake.Contrib account on Appveyor, we have got one build for all the projects that currently lives in that in that organization on GitHub. So we're going to want to add another one. So if I go ahead and now that I've added that repository into the Cake.Contrib organization, I can now add a repository, add a project on Appveyor for it. So if we scroll down this list, we should find one that says Cake.Net version detector, which is this one. And we're now good to go. So now the integration between GitHub and Appveyor has happened, so that any time I do a commit into that GitHub project, the GitHub repository, I will get a build started on this project within Appveyor. Now, you can, depending on how you prefer to do things, you can do everything through the user interface of Appveyor. I tend to not do it through the UI. I tend to do everything and define everything within a file that's in my source control system, because I find that that's much better in terms of knowing when things change and who changed them. And also it makes it crystal clear to people who are contributing to the project how things are being run. So over here, what we need to do is we need to create a .appveyor.yaml file, which will contain all the settings that we want to run. Now, what I could do is I could simply create that file, and I could fill in I could read the documentation, and I could all that sorts of things. Again, I found that I do that over and over again. I don't want to have to do it over and over again. So what I ended up creating is a VS Code extension that helps me with that. So I've created this thing called what I refer to as the CI/CD assets extension for Visual Studio Code. And its sole purpose in life is to download files, pre-configured files that are to my liking, that I can add into any new project that I'm starting up. So the way that that manifests itself is if I go up to the command palette here and I type CICD, or I think it was just CICD without the slash, then there are all these commands that allow me to download files that I use again and again on my open source projects. So one of those example is the Appveyor.yaml file. So all that's done is it's reached out to a GitHub repository that I've created. So if I walk over here and go to github.com/get13, and then let's find a repository in GitHub. Let me just find it so I can show you where all this is coming from. So if I go in here and go CI/CD here, then here is just a GitHub repository that contains all of those files. Again, putting them in a central location that I can consume and modify in one place rather than having to do it again and again. So all that command in Visual Studio Code has done is it's going to download this file and put it into my file system in the current project that I have open. So if we go back and have a look at what was created there, then this is a very basic definition for my appveyor.yaml file that will work the way I want it to. So just to talk through this slightly, I'm going to use the base build image that's called Visual Studio 2017. I'm going to execute PowerShell Bootstrapper, which in terms of how Cake works is how I'm actually going to kick off the build. I'm not going to run the Appveyor tests. I'm going to handle that within my Cake script. I only want to build branches that are from the develop and the master branch. That might be subject to change because I might want to handle other branches. So again, this is kind of a template for how to start the build, and it can be added to. Appveyor has this concept of a build cache. What that means is that once a build completes successfully, you have the opportunity to cache any particular folders that live as part of a build artifact or as part of the build process. So the way that Cake works is that it downloads all the add-ins, the tools, and the modules into a tools folder by default. So rather than having to download those each time, every time the build runs, Appveyor has this concept of a cache that it will cache all of those files to a quickly accessible location. So the next time the build runs, it will restore those files from that cache, and then they'll be there quicker than if you were to download them all from scratch again. So that's it. I mean, that's my appveyor.yaml file. So what we want to do now is this appveyor.yaml file expects that there's a build.ps1 file, and it sort of expects that there's this thing called a Cake.Recipe file. So the way that that's going to work is if I walk up to the command palette again, and this time search for Cake. So I've also got the Cake add-in for Visual Studio Code installed, and one of the things that it brings with it is this concept of installing a Bootstrapper. So that Bootstrapper is what will kick off the Cake build process and make the Cake script work. So I'm going to need one of those because my appveyor.yaml file expects there to be one of those. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that command, and I want to download the the PowerShell Bootstrapper, and I'm going to walk up to that same command again, and I'm going to download, because at some point I'm going to build this on both Windows and Mac or Linux. I want to have the shell, the bash equivalent of that Bootstrapper file. So the only slight change that I'm going to want to make here is that the default Bootstrapper expects that I'm going to be using a file called build.cake. I'm not going to be using that. I'm going to be using one called recipe.cake, because Cake.Recipe. Hopefully you can see what I did there. So I'm going to change that. And then over here, I'm going to change the same build.cake file to be recipe.cake in the build.sh file. Okay. So with that done, I now need my Cake.Recipe. I need to download that NuGet package as part of my build, and I need to reference all of those loose files that are going to be put onto the file system and execute it as part of the build process. Now, again, I could just go into here and say new file and create that recipe.cake file and start stubbing it out based on the documentation that's available. You'll probably have noticed by now that I'm a little bit lazy when it comes to that sort of stuff, and I'd much rather do that in a way that, again, is repeatable, and I don't have to worry about getting things wrong. So another extension that I've created is one called the Cake.Recipe VS Code extension, and it has a command for setting up the default Cake.Recipe.cake file that will be executed as part of a project that's running Cake.Recipe. So if I click on that, I will be prompted to provide the name of that file. So recipe.cake is the default, but you are welcome to change that to be something else. There's no hard and fast rule that says you have to call it recipe.cake, but I choose to do it that way. Now, I mentioned at the start that Cake.Recipe is quite opinionated and driven by a set of conventions that are, some of those are documented. If they're not documented, they will be soon. And one of those conventions is the name of the source folder that houses the .NET projects. So up here, I've got one called spelled out as source. You might have seen this as SRC, or you might have your own convention for what you want the folder structure to be. So I normally always use source because that's my preference, but again, you can change that to be whatever you want. So I'm just going to hit enter. Now, the next thing that's being prompted for here in terms of setting up this recipe.cake file is hint, hint, help needed for... I see. So there's a comment in the chat room from my friend Kim, who is an active user of Cake.Recipe and also a contributor to how it works. And I've got a lot to thank Kim for in terms of getting Cake.Recipe to where it is today. So yes, he's pointing out that there are some, let's call it, holes in the documentation for Cake.Recipe, and if you wanted to, you could definitely send a PR in for helping out with that documentation. That would be appreciated. Okay, so getting back to this. So what you're being prompted for here now is enter the name of the organization or owner of the GitHub repository. Now, the reason you need this is one of the things that Cake.Recipe brings to the table is the ability to control the releases that are stored in GitHub. Now, what that means is every time I do a release, I typically want to store on GitHub the actual final assets, the nutkeg, and any other pertinent information about the release that just happened. And I want to store that in the GitHub releases so that there's a single point of truth, if you like, for what that build was. So in order to make that happen, the Cake.Recipe needs to know where the GitHub repository is located. So you provide that at the time. So this repository now lives in the Cake contrib organization. So I'm going to put Cake contrib in there, and then it also wants to know the name of the repository. So I'm going to try and spell this out and get it right. So .NET version Detector. No, that's not right. Detector. There we go. So .NET version Detector, and I'm going to hit enter. So what that's going to do is it's going to stub out the basic recipe for running Cake.Recipe. So I mentioned earlier that at the minute Cake.Recipe is typically being consumed from a myget feed. So that's what's happening here, is I'm using the load preprocessor directive that comes with Cake to download the Cake.Recipe NuGet package from myget and extract it locally, right? There's another thing in Cake.Recipe that allows you to, or rather, let's say that differently. Cake.Recipe, in terms of its opinionated way of doing things and its convention-based way of doing things, is that it expects there to be a number of environment variables stored on the file system ready for consuming. Now, those environment variables will be things like the GitHub username and password to use when connecting to GitHub, the myget username and password or API key when you're pushing packages to myget, the NuGet API key when you're pushing to NuGet. All those things are typically stored as environment variables, and they all have an expected name in order for that to function. Now, if you're happy with the default names, you can simply call environment.setVariableNames method here, but you can also actually override any particular variable name with your own name of the environment variable you want to use. So that's what's going on there. This section is really setting up how the project-specific information for this instance of Cake.Recipe. So it's taking all those things that basically I put in as inputs into that command. So where the source folder is, what the name of the project is, I'm going to undo that, what the name of the project is, what the repository owner is, what the repository name is, all that sort of stuff. This is just a helper method that will print out the parameters that are being used as part of the build when I execute it as part of CI. And then this final section here is really setting up the tooling that's being used as part of Cake.Recipe. So for anyone who has done any sort of unit testing or code coverage, then you'll typically recognize something like this, whereas what I'm doing there is I'm excluding certain namespaces from the reports that are generated, because I don't care that the xUnit framework that I'm using is included in my unit test summary. I don't need to know that it's not covered. The other things in here are setting up where certain things can be found and excluding them from some of the tools that are executed as part of this. And then the final part down here is on the build factory that I have as part of Cake.Recipe is what I actually want to do. So what I'm doing here is I'm executing a .NET Core build. As I showed earlier, I ran .NET build and .NET test to build the project, because I'm using the new CSproj format, and I want to use .NET Core, .NET CLI to run that as part rather than MS build. So there is actually other methods you can run here, which is just build.run. So that would run a standard MS build. I'm just trying to think of a word. It will run just an MS build version of Cake.Recipe rather than the .NET CLI version of Cake.Recipe. So with that done, I'm essentially at a point where I could now run this build locally and it should work. So I'm going to try it out. So if I walk up to my PowerShell and I'm going to execute that build.ps1. I'm assuming I'm in the right place. I'm in the wrong folder now, so I need to go cd into where I recloned that repository, which is in organizations now, rather than my own one. So now I should have one in here that is Cake.Version Detector, and in here I should have some files. Am I in the wrong folder here? I think I might be in the wrong folder. Terminal. Yes, I'm in the wrong place. So I'm going to close this one, and I'm going to open up a new code window, and I'm just going to quickly do those things again, because I was in the wrong location. So now, if I do download of that Appveyor.yml file, and I'm going to download the bootstrappers again, you get to see this working again. And we'll download the bootstrapper, and then we'll also download the Cake.Recipe, which was source, and then it was Cake.Contrib, and then it was Cake.NET version Detector. That'll give us recipe.cake. So that means I need to go in here and change build.cake to be recipe.cake again. Recipe.cake. And then the build.sh needs to be done the same. Recipe.cake. Okay, so this time, if I do this properly, right, so now we've got a build.sh file. So if we run build.sh, that will start the Cake.Recipe recipe.cake file, which will start downloading things. So if we have a look at what's going on in code, what we'll see here is it started downloading, the Bootstrapper process is kicked in, it's downloaded Cake, it's downloaded Cake.Recipe, and within Cake.Recipe, it's extracted all of these scripts that I showed you before in the GitHub repository, and then it's loaded all of those into the current Cake execution, and it's then started downloading all of the add-ins that Cake.Recipe makes use of. So if we go back to PowerShell, we should see things starting to happen now that all of those dependencies have been downloaded onto the file system. So one of the first things that it does is it attempts to assert what version number we're currently building. Now it does that using a tool called GitVersion, and GitVersion is really about asserting what the current semantic version for a repository is, and it does that by looking at what branch you're on, what tags are in the repository, how many commits along from the last tag you are. It uses all of these things to assert the current version number of the repository. And then if we scroll back up here a little bit to where the setup was executed, then we can see that here on it's specifying that we're building version 0.1.0 unstable 001 of .Net version detector using version 32.1 of Cake and version 463 of Cake.Recipe. So as part of the build, we have all the information that we need to know what we're using to do the build process. Then I've got a show info, which is just outputting some of the build parameters that are going into the build process. We run a clean, so normally as part of a build, you want to tidy up the folder, the file system to remove any generated artifacts from the previous build. We then want to run .NET Core restore because we need to restore all the NuGet packages that are being used within the actual code itself. Then we run .NET Core build, and we're seeing the warnings that I showed at the start of the video, the start of the stream rather. Then once that's done, it's then running a utility tool called DupeFinder. So I'm a little bit OCD about certain things. I want my code to be formatted in a certain way. I don't want to duplicate code in multiple places. I don't want to have using statements that are unnecessary, all those sorts of things. So what Cake.Recipe does out the box is it uses two utility tools from JetBrains, one which is DupeFinder and one which is Inspect Code. And if any of those actually generate errors, it would actually fail the build. So if I've got a section of code that's repeated in one class and it's exactly the same in another one, I would be instructed to put that into a helper class or refactor it in such a way that it wasn't duplicated. And then what's happening is that the output of both of those utility tools are then being put into an issues report that I can take a look at. So if there were errors, I can look at the report to find out what was going on. The next thing that's going to happen is unit tests. So those 10 unit tests that I have within this project, they're going to be executed as part of running that .NET Core test. But it's also going to be wrapped up in OpenCover, and that OpenCover is going to generate a nice HTML report that we can look at. So now if we go back to our folder structure and have a look at what we've got as part of this build. So we've now got a tools folder, and that's where all of the Cake dependencies have been downloaded to. So that's what will be cached as part of our Appveyor build. So everything that goes into there won't have to be downloaded again. Appveyor will take care of restoring that for us. The other folder is this build artifacts folder. Now what this is for is where we would actually ultimately generate the NuGet packages and such for Cake.Recipe. The actual add-in will be added as a NuGet package and put into a folder in here. So if we look at this temp folder, what we've got is, again, it's a convention-based thing that anything that is a published library will end up in the published libraries folder. So we've got one library project, which is the actual add-in itself. So that's what's in here. And if we look in here, then this is where the actual DLL has been put in place for us. The other one is the unit tests folder. So you'll notice in the name up here, it might be hard to see, but this is actually published xUnit test. So Cake.Recipe is capable of looking for different unit test projects within a solution. So it knows about xUnit tests, it knows about NUnit tests, it knows about Fixe tests, and it knows about MS test or VS test projects. And it will actually create those as separate folders as part of the build, so that you can see which one came and went to where. Okay, so we've got a single unit test project, which is the .test project you can see there. And then what's been generated for us within the test results is that DupeFinder created an XML file, Inspect Code created an XML file, and then the Cake.Issues utility tool that's being used within Cake.Recipe then generates this nicely formatted HTML file that tells us if there were any errors, warnings, suggestions, that sort of things. So in terms of what I have within this project, there's 11 suggestions of things that could be done better and 1 warning, but there's no actual errors. So there's nothing that would make me want to change those things immediately. But it is something I can refer back to if I've got a lazy day sometime. I can go and fix these if I really wanted to. And then that's it at the minute. Now, what I said was that Cake.Recipe will generate a new Git package, but that hasn't happened, right? So there's 2 things that we need to fix immediately here, and I wanted to show you them because they can trip us up the first time round. The first thing I wanted to talk about is that if I go up here and look at the output after the .NET Core test, what we'll see here is there's a mention here that there's no results. So the .NET test executed, and we know that those 10 tests passed, but there's nothing for the OpenCover tool to actually utilize to generate a coverage report. And we want that coverage report because we're going to publish that as part of the build so that we can see if our code coverage is getting better or worse as the project goes on. So the reason that that's not working is if I go up to GitHub and look at Cake.Contrib, and I look at Cake.Recipe, then if we look at the documentation for Cake.Recipe, which is hosted over here, and look at the documentation, and then look down here at the code coverage section, then what we need to do is we need to enable the OpenCover doesn't support portable PDBs at the minute. Now, by default, a new .NET Core project is going to use those portable PDBs, so we need to instruct the project to output the full PDBs so that we can get those code coverage metrics in play. Cake.Recipe might be changing at some point to use a new tool that is better suited for .NET Core projects, so this step won't be necessary, but at the minute it is. So what we need to do is we need to go to our both CS.Proj files, both the unit test project and the library project, and instruct it to output the full PDBs. So if we go to that one and then go to the tests one, which is this one, and just put that information in there, then if we run that build again, now the build this time will be much faster. There's a note there from Kim in the chat room about not necessarily recommending doing that because it's going to embed all of that debug information into the DLL file. I think you're right there. So that, like I say, this is the need for this at the minute is to solely get code coverage metrics out of Cake.Recipe. If we do move to the alternative tool, that step won't be necessary because it'll be a tool aimed more at .NET Core project, so it won't be it won't do that. So what I was going to say there was only works with PDB cover. Rather use debug type PDB only, which only works with OpenCover. So are you saying that we need to change the documentation, Kim? Because at the minute, or you're saying only, I see what you're saying. Right. So the recommendation from, so the reason that Kim is useful in this scenario is because Kim created this piece of documentation. So he knows it better than I do. So yeah, PDB only or using the full one. So for I'm going to leave it as full at the minute, but PDB only would be an alternative way of doing it as well. So what I was going to say was that this time round, the build itself should be that bit quicker because all of those add-ins and tools and modules and all the that Cake.Recipe depends on didn't need to be downloaded. But if we look at the build now, we don't have that error that was saying that it wasn't able to do what it needed to do. It's now been able to generate that report. So if we go over to the test coverage folder and look at the index.htm, and we'll just leave that as Chrome for going forward, then we'll see we've got a nice code coverage metrics that contains all of the information about the project as it currently stands. Okay, so that was the first thing that we need to correct. The second one is that we're not getting any NuGet packages being created as part of our build, and we need to get them, right? So the first thing that I want to do before we get to that is I'm going, and I'll discuss this in a bit, add Cake.Recipe. I'm just going to create an issue for the work that we've been doing to date. So add Cake.Recipe apologies for the cough there. I'm going to add an issue to kind of cover some of the work that we've been doing because I like to have an issue for most of the work that I do as part of the projects that I work on, because I find it easier to refer back to an issue to then know what changed within a specific issue. So this one is going to be about adding Cake.Recipe, add Cake.Recipe build to project. And I'm just going to go ahead and I don't think I've got any milestones yet. We'll come back to that in a second as well. I'm just going to submit an issue because I'm going to commit what we have done so far, which is to add an Appveyor YAML file, the Bootstrappers, Cake.Recipe, and the modification to the CS.proj files. And the other one that's slipped in here is this packages.config file. So we recommend, we being the Cake team, recommend that you pin to a specific version of Cake rather than always pulling the latest version. So the addition of this packages.config file ensures that it will always use that version of Cake rather than downloading the latest one if and when it's available. So I'm just going to commit this here and say added basic Cake.Recipe build. I'm just going to go ahead and commit that. Yes, I do want to do that. Okay, so the reason I've done that is I've done some of the work of getting this build up and running before coming onto the live stream, because I didn't want you guys to have to sit and watch me fill out certain things. So the reason that the reason that there's no NuGet package being created at the minute is twofold. There's two ways of having, within Cake.Recipe, there are two ways of generating the NuGet packages. The first would be to go up to the Cake.Recipe set parameters, and we could go in here and say should run .NET Core pack and set that to true. Now what that would do is that would instruct the task that's specifically about packing the new .NET Core projects would then run .NET Core pack as part of the build process rather than skipping it. Because if we go back and look at what's happening here, then currently the .NET Core pack task is being skipped. Now, the reason that there's a specific .NET Core pack and also a NuGet pack task is historical. So one way the project worked was to use NuGets in its entirety, and the newer way of doing things with .NET Core is to use .NET Core pack. Now, there's lots of reasons that I won't go into as part of this. I don't do it that way. I like to have a little bit more control over the way that the NuGet packages are being created. So I tend to still have a new spec file that I put into my repository. Now, the way that Cake.Recipe works is that it expects that new spec file to be in a particular location, and when that location is identified, it will run the NuGet pack on that new spec file to generate the NuGet package. So if I go up to here and say git status and make sure we're clean, which we are, if I do a git branch -a, that wasn't an A, that was an S, then we'll see that I've got a new spec branch available for so that's where I've done the work of doing those things. So if I do a git checkout -b of new spec, and that's going to come from upstream new spec, then git fetch. Oh, it's going to have an update. That's probably why. Let's do that. There we go. And I'm going to do a rebase of that onto where we are just now. So git rebase of this onto develop, just so that it is there. So what we should now find is that there is a new spec folder, and that new spec folder contains a new get folder. Now you might be wondering why I'm being specific like that. The reason is that as part of Cake.Recipe, I might actually want to generate chocolatey packages as well. So Cake.Recipe is aware of chocolatey, and it can segregate out a chocolatey package from a NuGet package by having a new spec file for chocolatey in a different location. Okay, so that's why there is a double level of folders in place there. Let's just say yes to that to get rid of it just now. So now that we have that new spec folder in the correct location, if we run this build again, what should happen this time is it will find those, or rather, it will find that single new spec file. So in that new spec file, I have all the information that I want, which is the name of the ID of the package, the title, the authors, all of the standard information that's expected. And then I'll also control what files are being put into that new nupcake folder. And that's what's happening in the latter part of the new spec there. So now, once the build finishes, what we should, in our build artifacts folder, we should have a new packages folder. And that packages folder is going to contain the generated Cake.Net version detector.nupkeg ready for going somewhere. Okay? So if all goes well, once this static analysis completes, we should. This is the worst thing about doing these live streams, is waiting for things to finish when you think. See, I knew someone was going to ask about that, and I had a feeling that it was going to be Matthias. So Matthias is pointing out that there's a new way of specifying the license file in the new spec. So currently, in my new spec, I am currently using what's now referred to as the old school way of adding a license URL. What I should be using is a new format that simply puts in MIT, right? So actually what we'll see as part of the NuGet pack that is executed is there'll actually be a build warning that says we should be doing it a different way. I decided to not do that as part of this demonstration because I didn't want to run the risk of things going wrong. So what we've now got, if we look at the output here, is we've now created NuGet packages. So if we scroll up a little bit, it finished the test, and now, rather than skipping this step, it's now went ahead and it's found that new spec. It has run NuGet pack, and it's generated a nupkeg for us. So now I'm not seeing the warning that I was expecting. Oh, it maybe only appears on a higher level verbosity setting in the build output. So if we look at packages now, we've now got this nupkeg folder that contains everything that we want. And we can verify that if we go back to Visual Studio Code and we drill down into the packages folder. We can right click on this and say explore zip file. And if we drill down here, we can see that this NuGet package, I move this up a little bit. We can look in the lib folder, and in the lib folder we've got netstandard 2, and in there we've got a DLL, we've got a PDB, and we've got an XML file. So we're now in a situation where we are pretty much ready to push this into Appveyor and have it run the build. So if I go back to the command line here, and I'm just going to take this, I'm going to do a git checkout of the develop branch, and I'm going to do a git merge of that new spec branch into my develop, and I'm going to do a git push. So if I do this git push, what we should see happen is, okay, so I'm going to cheat slightly. I'm going to push this. Normally I would do a PR. So I would normally do git push origin, which is pushing to my fork, and then I would do a PR from my fork into the upstream repository, which is the Cake.Contrib one. Now, I'm going to cheat a little bit here, and I'm going to say I'm going to just push directly to upstream, which will circumvent that need to do a PR. But everything else being equal, that's what I would normally do. Okay? So we're doing a git push upstream, and if we go back to Appveyor and look at our projects, then here is our Cake.NET version detector project, and if we click into that, we've now got a build that's just been triggered with that commit we just pushed to GitHub. Now, this build may or may not work. Okay? Now, the reason it may or may not work is because when we were running locally when we ran the build locally on my machine, there are certain steps that aren't executed. And now that certain steps are things like the publishing steps, because I don't want a publish to happen when I'm running locally. I don't want a package to suddenly appear on my Git or to suddenly appear on NuGet. I want those things to happen only when it's being executed as part of a CI build. I only want artifacts pushed to my Git and pushed to NuGet from a CI build. I don't want them to happen locally. Now, when I run, and we can actually see this in action when we start looking at the Appveyor.yaml file. So the Appveyor.yaml file, which was, let's minimize this again. Minimize these down. So the Appveyor.yaml file actually does something slightly different. So locally, I was just running the default task in my Cake.Recipe scripts. Here I'm specifically running the Appveyor target. Now that includes some additional dependencies which cause those packaging tasks to be executed. Now when I run it in Appveyor, that's going to fail because I haven't added the environment variables that I spoke about. So the environment variables need to be set up and configured. Now, if I look at another project in a Cake.Contrib Appveyor one, so if I go ahead and look at, say, this one, then if I look at the environment variables, then the environment variables are relatively numerous. If I look at environment here, then there's quite a lot of environment variables that are expected for Cake.Recipe to work. They're all here. Now I could spend my time on this stream adding them in manually, but again, I'm not going to do that. I need to set those up in a way that is easier, because I need it to be repeatable. So if I go over to another machine that I've got running over here, I can actually run a script that will do that work for me. So let's just prove that I'm not doing anything out of the ordinary here. If I can get my mouse back, my mouse has gone over here. If I click on environment, then we'll see that currently there are no environment variables on this project. But if I run a project that I've got over here, what we'll end up with is a set of populated environment variables in this Appveyor project. So let me just run that in the background where you can't see it. It's over there. It's running just now. Let's just make sure that that happens. Okay, good. So then we come over here and refresh this page. We should now have a set of populated environment variables if Appveyor is working the way I want it to. There we go. Beautiful. And now if we go back to projects and we look at Appveyor.net version detector, it's saying that it succeeded, which I wasn't necessarily expecting. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that to work. I can only assume that that doesn't make any sense. I don't know how it was able to push to MyGet because I don't think those environment variables were set at the time when I executed that build. So I'm not entirely sure about how that worked, but it did work. So if we were to go and look, if we go up here and look at the output of where it did the MyGet push publish, no, it didn't work. There we go. Okay, so that makes more sense. So the build succeeded, but the actual task didn't actually execute because the credentials aren't available. So it attempted to push to MyGet, but it didn't. It wasn't able to do it because the credentials hadn't been set. So that's good. I sort of expected the build to fail there, but we're live, so it's all good. So the other additional things that happened as part of the packaging step was that it uploaded some Appveyor artifacts. It's identified the build is aware of where the CI process is running. So whether it's running on Appveyor, whether it's running on Azure DevOps or somewhere else. So because it's running on Appveyor, it knows it's capable of uploading the artifacts. So the artifacts in this case are the issues report that we spoke about earlier, and also the nutcake itself. Okay. So the build works. So we've now got a partial CI system up and running. So a couple of things that we need to fix first. So if we go back down here and have a look down here, is that it attempted to push the coveralls. So we shouldn't the overall build process fail. So there's a question in the chat room about whether it should have worked that way, and it's a good question. It's a little bit subjective. The build failure in this case that I expected would have meant that it didn't fail because it never actually attempted it. If it attempted to push the MyGet and something went wrong with the push to MyGet, then it would fail the build. In this case, the project hasn't been configured correctly. So that's not technically a build failure because the build steps never actually executed to result in the failure. You could make it so that that's the way that it works, but it really depends. It really depends. It would have failed normally. This is an option. Correct. So what Matthias is saying in the chat room is that normally that the lack of the credentials would have resulted in a failed push, and that would have failed the build. But we've taken steps in Cake.Recipe to explicitly say if the credentials aren't available, then simply don't do anything and don't fail to build. So that's a convention, again, that I've put in place in Cake.Recipe to make that work the way it does. Okay. So what we want to do is the next time we run this build, those myget credentials will be there. So it will attempt to push to myget. But this one here, which is the pushing of the code coverage report to coveralls.io, won't work. And it won't work because the API token that's needed to push to, that's the wrong project. The API token that's needed to push to coveralls is project specific. It's always the same. It's always different. So it's not something I can make the same. So that's the utility tool that I've got over here for creating those environment variables. Can't set that parameter because it's different for each one. So although I've got a tool that creates almost all of the environment variables, there's one here. There's two additional ones that I need to add manually. And those are documented up here in the home repository. So if I come up to here and look at the Cake.Contrib home repository, what we'll find is some documentation around what needs to be done when adding a project into Cake.Contrib. And those are for adding two environment variables, one that's called coveralls repo token. So let's go down here and add a new variable called coveralls repo token. And we'll add another new one that is called the YAM deploy remote, and we'll come on to that in a little bit. So what we need to do in the YAM remote is to make it something like this. Copy this part. And I'll explain what's going on in here in a little bit. Dotnet version Detector. And the other one is I need to go to coveralls.io and get a repo token. So here's one I created earlier. I'm already signed into coveralls.io. If I go into here and say add repo, then in theory I should find one called .net. If it's not there, then what we'll need to do is sync the repos so that it comes through. And then if I search again for .net, Cake.net, there's this one here. What I need to do is I need to turn that on, and I need to grab this token here, which I'm trusting that no one will do anything with. That would be good. I'll maybe change it after this video. Let's make that a secure one and scroll down and hit save. So now we've got a coveralls repo token that will work, and it'll push that code coverage report to coveralls.io. So what we can do is we can walk back up to the history here, and I'm going to say never there. And if I click on this one and say rebuild the commit, then it's going to rebuild that same commit again, but now that we've got those environment variables in play, it should alter the build slightly because everything is there that it needs to complete that build. And again, the build this time around should be slightly quicker because Appveyor is going to be able to use that cached tools repository. So you can see it happen there on line 5. It's taking that tools repository from a quickly accessible location that it has, and it's restoring it into the same folder that it was there before. So rather than having to download all of those packages again and again and again, they're there much quicker. Okay, so the build will run, and now this time we should have a package pushed to myget, and we should have code coverage reports pushed to coveralls.io. So let's just make sure that that runs the way that we expect it to, and then we'll get on to the next part, which is adding documentation for a project. Now, no one likes to talk about documentation, but documentation is really a necessary evil. It needs to be done, and we just need to do it, right? So what the tool that I've settled on for almost all of the projects that I work on now is YAM.io. So this is a .NET static documentation generator that's written by fellow Cake fellow Cake maintainer, Dave Glick, and it's very good at what it does. It will take a set of markdown files and generate some HTML. It will dig into an actual DLL or a set of source files, and it will generate documentation from XML comments that are contained within the source code. It essentially builds up a model of the documentation in memory, and it allows you to manipulate that model in any way that you want to. So this is the one that I've settled on, and I'm going to show you how that I can make use of that within this project. Let's just make sure that this build succeeds and does the things that we expect it to. Close out some of these tabs now that we've spoken about them. And we'll get on to the ones that are left. The issues report we're done with. That one we're done with. And that one we're done with. So I'll maybe just grab my Get credentials so that I can sign in here. And we can see the package that ends up in my Get if it gets there. So that's going to be this one. So the Cake contrib organization has a dedicated myget feed that is specifically for all of the add-ins that live in the Cake contrib organization on GitHub. And right now, if we do a search for .NET, we should only find the two existing ones that start with that. We don't have the .NET version detector on there yet. But if we get to where, let's have a look at where the build is getting to. So we're at the point that we've done the compilation, we've done the stack analysis, and we've generated a report. We've done the unit test, and we're generating a code coverage report. Now it's generating the NuGet package. It's uploading the artifacts, and we'll see here now, rather than skipping the publish myget packages, it's now successfully pushed to myget, and hopefully, where's the one that I'm looking for? Upload coveralls report. There's no output, so I think it worked. So if we go back to here and refresh this page, and then do that search again, Cake.Bot, no, let's try that, .NET. So now we've got Cake.NET version detector. So it is on the myget feed, and it's now consumable. It would have failed if that environment variables were wrong, and it would have failed to build. But now we've got a package that is ready to be consumed. So if you wanted to, you could go and grab that myget package onto your machines and attempt to execute the Cake.NET version detector add-in as part of your build process. So the other one that we spoke about was coveralls.io. So let's just check to see if that actually ended up working. So I'm going to go back into this guy, coveralls.io. And let's just see if the code coverage report got uploaded. It did. So currently we are at 64% complete. And if we click onto this, we can drill down into what is covered, what's not covered. And basically you can use coveralls.io to help monitor whether your code coverage is getting better or worse and so on. Okay, so that part works as well. Right, so myget's done. So the thing that's left up here that we need to talk about is documentation. So the reason that the documentation steps aren't running or not doing anything is because there is no documentation for it to build. So again, it's convention based. It expects documentation to live in a certain location, and that certain location is a docs folder, right? So again, in a way that I didn't want you to have to sit here and watch me type the documentation, I've got that already in branch, ready to be merged. So if we do another git checkout, and we're going to do git checkout -b of docs from upstream. Oops. Okay. So now we've got a docs branch And again, we'll just, for the sake of keeping things clean, we'll rebase that on the current head of the develop. And then we'll go and have a look in Visual Studio Code. So now in Visual Studio Code, we can see that we have a docs folder. And in that docs folder, we have an input folder. So YAM works on the premise of a set of input source files, and then it will, by default, it will create an output folder. And that output folder is where it will take the input source files, the markdown files, the whatever it is that you're looking at, and it will output into rendered HTML files. So then within that input folder, you can then have any sort of folder structure that you want. And now I tend to have one called docs, and then within there I have whatever kind of top level headings I want to create. So an example in here is that I've created an examples.md file that talks about how you would consume or how you would get the Cake.Version detector add-in into your build. So that's just by using the add-in preprocessor directive and consuming it from NuGet once it gets to NuGet. Obviously, it's not there yet, so this wouldn't work. And then it will show you then what C# code you need to add to your Cake script to actually execute the .NET version detector. So what I want is I want all of these files to be brought into the YAM build process, and I want to push that to somewhere that then people can view it. So there is a task that I can use here. If I do a build.ps1 with a target of preview documentation, then what this is going to execute is it's going to execute YAM locally on my machine, and it's going to do everything that I just said, which is to take those source files, it's going to compile them, manipulate them, stick them all together, and it's going to look at, it's going to generate a website. And that website is then going to run locally in a web server that YAM provides, and I'm going to be able to view that documentation locally before I push it to GitHub to go somewhere else. So we'll see here YAM executing. So Cake.Recipe currently uses a slightly older version of YAM. So it's using 1.7.4 that is only executable on .NET Framework. I don't think it works particularly well with Mono on another operating system. So at the minute, Cake.Recipe will only do the documentation tasks when it's running on a Windows machine. And that's why I'm running on my Windows box here. But there is actually a new version of YAM that is a .NET Global tool that will run everywhere. So one of the tasks that I'm going to have to do at some point is to update Cake.Recipe to use the latest version of YAM so it will run on everywhere that want to do this work rather than having it specifically on a Windows machine. Now, there is some work that I need to do while this is building. There's a lot of things happening behind the scenes here. YAM is downloading a bunch of NuGet packages that it needs in order to execute the build, and then it's going to be inspecting my source code files and putting things together so that the initial build of YAM in the preview documentation takes a little while to run. So while that's doing that, there is some preparation work that I need to do. And for that, I'm going to go over to my blog, which in itself is a YAM documentation site. So the blog that you're looking at here is one that was generated by YAM, and you'll see that down at the bottom, generated by YAM. There we go. So in my archives here, I have a blog post I always refer to when I'm doing this, because the way that I publish the YAM documentation for a project is to use GitHub pages. So what I need to do on the what I need to do is I need to create an orphaned branch that I can start sticking documentation into. Now, I always forget how to do that, but that's why I've got this code snippet here that will do all of that work for me. Okay, so while I'm going to run these steps once the YAM build's finished and once I'm ready to go. So let's just check to see how this is going on. So the YAM build has completed. It's executed all these various pipeline steps to look for blog posts, pages, categories, archives, lots of stuff, all of which has been soaked up into Cake.Recipe, so you can just run Cake.Recipe and have all of these things available to you. So the end result of that is it's added a web server, and it's listening on port 5080 for requests. So if we go up to here and go to localhost 5080, and it was /cake.net version detector. Okay, we hit that, then this is the documentation site that YAM has generated for us. So it's got some, it obviously needs some work in terms of this title isn't particularly good, but that's just because of the length of the default title that my project is using. So what it's done is it's generated this top level documentation tab, and that then has the example usage that I showed you as a markdown format. So this is then taken that markdown and rendered it as HTML. What it's also got though is this API section, which has drilled into the DLL that was generated by the build, and it's pulled out all of the XML comments that I included as part of my source code. So if I go back to here and look in my source folder and look in Cake.net version detector and then look in the aliases class, then I've included various XML comments for the top level methods that are accessible, and provided examples and code usage and all that sort of stuff that is kind of expected. And what YAM has done for me is it's taken all of that and then generated this MSDN style documentation that lists out all of the methods, the attributes, the properties, and then if I drill down further down into one of these, it's then got the example usage that I provided as part of the XML comments. So for very little effort, assuming you're using XML comments and you're expanding on the syntax that's available within those, you get a fairly easily generated documentation site for the code that you've been creating anyway, and it has the ability to search for things, all that sort of stuff. Now, the good thing about doing that in this scenario is that ultimately I'm going to want to take my add-in and I'm going to want to push it and make the main Cake website available or know about my add-in so that the documentation can flow into its API section. So again, Cake.build.net is generated by YAM. So if the documentation works here in my implementation of it, it'll ultimately work once I push it to Cake.build.net. So it's a good kind of strategy to make sure that the documentation works the way you want it to before we push it to Cake.build.net. Okay, so YAM is working the way I want it to, so I can just Control-C out of that to come back to my command line, and I'm going to go and create that orphaned GitHub Pages branch on my repository so that I can have that documentation available on GitHub. There's a modified file there for something I wasn't necessarily... Oh, that's a missing... I need to add that to my gitignore file. So what I didn't show on that, it's gone now, so I can't show you. I'll show you it once it gets pushed up. There's another step that actually looks at the task graph that Cake.Recipe has generated and provides a UI or a graphical representation of those tasks, so you can see how things are interconnected within Cake.Recipe, and it publishes that as part of the documentation. Now the generated tasks folder is something that will be regenerated each time the build runs, so we don't want to check that into source control, so we're going to add an entry into our gitignore file to include that. So if we go down to the bottom here and just add a new entry for, let's just add in YAM, and we're going to put it into docs, input, and then tasks. It should be enough, hopefully. And then over here, there we go. So we're going to add a build, updated gitignore Okay, so with that done, I can go back to my master branch, or my develop branch, sorry, my main branch, and I'm going to merge in the docs branch that I've been working on, which is here. And then I'm not going to push that yet because I need to create the orphaned GitHub Pages branch before I'll be able to do that. So I'm going to grab the first 4 or 5 lines of this, and I'm going to execute those here. There we go. That's fine. And then what we need to do is the final step, which is this git push, but I'm going to do it slightly differently. So again, normally that would go to the origin, but in this case, I'm going to put it to the upstream because that's where everything lives. Copy that. That didn't work. No, just write it. Git push set upstream, and then it's just gh-pages. Okay. By doing that, if we look at GitHub, what we should find now on here is that there is another GitHub Pages branch, and in there is one HTML file. That's the one that those 4 or 5 commands generated an index.html file, and it's now there, ready to be consumed. And if we look at the settings in our GitHub repository, then what we should find is that GitHub Pages has now been activated on that GitHub Pages branch, and there's the my branch that I put there, right? So if we go back to the command line and do a git checkout of develop again, now we're going to do a git push upstream. So again, circumventing the pull request process, and we should now have, once that build completes, is it will generate that YAM documentation. It'll generate that YAM documentation on the fly, and it will push that code to the GitHub Pages branch, ready for viewing. Okay, so with that running, so that will have kicked off another Appveyor build. So if we go up here and look at history, then we should get another one here. That did work, didn't it? Git push upstream and git push. Oh, I think I have inadvertently broken myself, and I'll tell you for why. So in my default appveyor.yaml file, I have a skip build step that is looking for a regular expression for doc in the commit message. And I think I have inadvertently triggered that skip step to not run the build. That's not going to help. So let's just do one more commit just to force that. So let's just have a look at the docs and just change something slightly. Examples.md, and then you can execute .NET version detector, and then you can execute. That really doesn't make much sense, does it? So let's just change that. Let's just make that. Then you execute version using. Okay, let's just save that, and let's just give that a commit message like updated, corrected grammar, let's call it. Okay. Fix typo in .NET version detector. Yeah, I probably should do that, Kim. Thank you. Kim's suggesting that I change that to make it not have a spelling mistake. Well spotted. Corrected grammar and typo. Save that. Always save how to do that again. And then let's do a git push upstream and push origin, and then that should give us a Appveyor CI build. Hopefully. There we go. Okay, so that will now run and generate the YAM documentation and push it to the GitHub Pages branch, ready for our viewing pleasure. Okay, so I'm going to let that run. So now where we're at is there's a couple of other things that I want to talk about. The other things, let's do them in order. There's a couple of services that I'm now using quite extensively. These are services that kind of just help with the kind of more mundane tasks that need to be done as part of my build. So one of them is Mergify. So Mergify is a service that you can use for free. There's a commercial offering as well, but it can be used on open source projects. Mergify is all about doing stuff when a pull request is submitted and a pull request is merged, and so on. So I only use kind of the top level abilities of Mergify. What I like to do is I like to have it automatically close a pull request branch when the pull request is closed. So I'm not yet at the point of trusting automated processes to do everything that I want correctly. So I don't use Mergify to automatically merge pull requests. I could, but I don't. Right? So Mergify is a service I would encourage you to take a look at, and what it has is some syntax that you can put into a YAML file that allows you to specify how you want those merges to be handled. So again, if I go back over to Visual Studio Code here, I'll do one thing first. Let's go back up to my issues, and I'm going to add a new issue for add Mergify. So again, just so that I've got some traceability of what I've been working on and why I've been doing it, I'm just going to add an issue here to add Mergify. So this is issue 3. So if I'm on my develop branch, if I close some of what I've got open here, and I go back to my command palette and I go back to my CI/CD, then I've got one here for generating a Mergify.yaml file. So this is, again, information that you could get from the Mergify documentation. I just choose to put it into a file that I can reuse over and over again. So what this is saying is delete the head branch of the pull request once it has been merged. It's a relatively simple natural language syntax that you use. And once you've implemented it, all this will do is delete the branch of the pull request if it has access to it when that pull request is merged. So that's what I've done here. That's all I'm doing here. So if I go and just say add Mergify YAML file, and let's go ahead and commit that. So that's what Mergify is going to do, and we'll maybe show that in action by doing a pull request for the next one, and to see how that will work. And we'll see how that actually closes off the branch as well. So the other one is Dependabot. So Dependabot is actually, I haven't actually done what I need to do there, have I? Let's go back to mergify.io. I need to add the project into my profile here. So I want to go ahead and add another account, and I want to go ahead and add contrib, and I want to select the repository that I have just created, and that will enable Mergify on that repository, and it will make it do its thing. Almost there. Set up Mergify on your account. One last step is to do the Mergify.yaml file, which we've actually already done that. Okay. So in here, public, but Mergify is installed, but it's not configured. So it hasn't identified that Mergify.yaml file is there because we haven't actually pushed it yet. But once it is, it will be able to do its thing. So let's just see if the documentation has generated. So if we scroll down to the bottom here and have a look at what actually happened, then the clean documentation step ran and the publish documentation step ran. So in theory, if we go and bring this up in a new tab, then in our GitHub Pages branch, we should have a lot more stuff than we did before. So previously we had just an index.html file in there. Now it has all the generated assets from YAM. So if we go back into the settings here and find that URL one more time, I can say open a new tab, and it is not. It is. So that was just a refresh of my local cache to make it appear. So now I have all of that documentation available on that GitHub Pages branch, and the thing I wanted to show you before was this. So if I look at the clean step, so what this is showing you is this task section is generated as part of the build. It actually shows all of the interconnections of how Cake.Recipe is actually formed. So if you click on any one of these targets, it will show you the dependencies that exist on that target being successful in order for it to actually work. So it's a good way of visualizing what's going on with Cake.Recipe and figuring out why one target is working and maybe not another one working as you expect it to. So that's useful, hopefully. So that's the documentation side of things taken care of. And what we need to do now is get my Mergify running. So for that, we'll want a pull request that we can actually work with. So what we'll do is we should have a commit ready to go, which is the adding of the Mergify.yaml file. So let's just push that, and then we'll work on activating Dependabot, and we'll do that as a PR. So let's push this to origin as well. So Dependabot needs to be activated. And it needs to be activated on the type of project that you are going to be working with. So over here, we're going to say grant access to additional repositories. And I'm going to scroll down here, and I'm going to select version detector, and I'm going to add it in, and I'm going to say save. Now that we've added that in, if we go back over here and we look at what projects we have available, let's come out of add. So we should have a new one, which is for .NET version detector. .NET version detector. Or does it not? Does it need to run at least once? Is Pascal still on the call? He is. Pascal, do you know if it needs to run a build at least once before it will? Oh no, sorry, it's here. Okay, so I'm adding a repo. Now that I've told Dependabot about the repository that I want to add into it, I can now say what type of language my repository is going to be running on. So it's automatically detected it's a .NET project, which is what I want it to be. So I'm going to go ahead and say add selected. Repo must contain or packages.config file. Oh, there's an additional setting that I need to set, which is where things can be found. So if I go ahead and put source in there, runtime dependency PRs to merge automatically, none, it's okay. So I'm going to update those settings, and I'm going to add selected. So now, having added that source property, it now knows where to look for those things. And now it's going to automatically check. So the whole premise of Dependabot is to keep all of your dependencies up to date. And it's going to automatically create pull requests when it detects that there are dependencies that are out of date. Now, you could set it up so that it will merge those things automatically, and with Mergify, you could definitely work together to have those things two working in unison. I choose not to do that. I want to take ownership of actually doing that final merge step, but that's totally up for debate. Okay, so there's been a comment in the chat room about whether Dependabot could work with .cake files. Actually, I've spoken with the creator of Dependabot, and he doesn't think it would be too much work to get Dependabot to work on the .cake files. So what we're talking about there is your preprocessor directives for add-ins, for tools, and for modules to see whether there are new versions of those tools available. It is possible, it just needs someone to do the work. Now, I believe I'm right in saying that. No, I'm lying. I can't remember what Dependabot is written in. It's not a language that I'm familiar with, though, so I wasn't able to take on the work. But if anyone is interested, there is an open issue about adding Cake support into Dependabot and making it another language that can be added into. There you go. If it's Ruby, that's why I didn't offer my services, because I don't know enough Ruby to help with that. But it's definitely something that's on the cards, and it's something that we may have in the future. Okay, so to see Mergify in action, we need to have something going up there. So there's a couple of things in my CI/CD pipeline assets that I still want to add into this repository. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get those added in so that everything is there. So I'm just going to create a new issue just so I've got something, or actually let's just put it onto the same issue, which is adding Cake.Recipe. So there's a couple of things in here. First one is an editor.config file. It's a very basic one, but I typically use editor.config on all of my IDEs just so that there's consistency on spacing and that sort of stuff. This is a very, very basic editor config file. There are much more elaborate ones that you can use, but this is my starting point for how I will run a build. So let's just git checkout -b, and then we're going to just call this issue GH2. We're going to call that from the pellet, and we're going to create a PR using that branch I've just created there. The other one in my CI/CD is my config.ym file. I forgot this when I added the documentation, but ym has the ability to configure the way that the documentation pipeline is created. The creator of ym is from the United States, so by default ym runs as enus, which I don't like because of the date time format that comes with. So I choose to change that as part of my normal ym configuration to make that into engb. So I'm going to add that in. CI/CD, what other files? GitReleaseManager.yml file. I'm going to add this now, and we'll talk about that in the next part, which is when we actually release this project. So I'll just add it in, and we'll come back to that in a second. We're just going to mark this as GH2, and this is for added additional build files. Just call it that. Right. So what I want to do is I want to push that to my origin. And it's going to tell me that it can't because it needs to be marked as an upstream, and that's fine. So let's go ahead and do that. So that's pushing to my fork rather than to the one that we've been pushing to directly. So if we go to the root of this repository, it should know that there is an active pull request now for this. So if I go ahead and say compare and just make sure that it's got everything that I expected, new files for editor config, yada yada yada. So let's go ahead and create a pull request. So normally you'd want this to be reviewed by someone, or you want to sanity check it, and you'd want to make sure that the build completes and all that sort of stuff. I don't necessarily want to wait for that because I want to go on to the next step. So I'm going to merge without the PR successfully building. Normally I wouldn't do that ever, but let's go ahead and do it now so that we can see Mergify in action. So if I click on confirm merge here, what I'll end up with in my GitHub repository is a delete branch. But what should happen is that Mergify is going to come along and delete that for me if it's working correctly. So let's just check to see if it thinks that it's working. I thought I added that. Oh, it is. We configure refresh that. Why has it not picked it up? Oh, it is there. Mergify is installed and configured. So in theory, that branch should disappear. But I'm not convinced that Mergify is aware of this repository yet. But so that's unfortunate. I'm hoping that was going to work. Because, I mean, it's very simple for me to just delete that. But it's one of these things that also gets forgotten about and you get left with stale branches lying in your repository. So having Mergify running to kind of look after that is definitely something that is useful. Quite why Mergify isn't picking it up just yet, I don't know, but certainly my expectation. Good point. I thought in this instance, so the point that Kim's made in the document in the chat room is that if it's made from the same repo, I thought given that I had so the token that I had used to create Mergify, it has access to both my one and the one in Cake.Contrib. So I thought it would have deleted it as well, but you could be right. That it'll only delete the ones from the same repository. We can maybe test that out in the next part of the build process. So, I've talked about Mergify and I've talked about Dependabot, but I also didn't show it very well because my demonstration didn't work, but that's beside the point. So the next step is really to deploy something. We're at a point now where we have a working build. We have a NuGet package that is pushed to MyGet. And let's imagine the scenario that we've actually taken that artifact from MyGet and we've actually tested it locally, which maybe some of you have done. I don't know. We're actually at a point where we want to push to NuGet, right? So there's a couple of things that will need to happen in order for that to work. Now, you've seen me as I've been going through here, I've been creating issues. Now, that's because I almost always work with an issue when I'm doing a scope of work, because that helps me then generate a set of release notes from that information rather than having to look back through commits to figure out what happened. I do that up front. I create an issue, I do some work. That issue, I will use the nomenclature in my commit message that is GH-3, so it kind of links a commit to an issue, so that I've got full traceability of commits that went into a repository and why they went in and what they were for. So you'll always see me create an issue, and you'll also see me label those issues with a specific label and add them to a milestone so that I can actually create a set of release notes using that information when I'm ready to do a release. Now, unfortunately, the labels that come with a new repository aren't necessarily to my liking. They don't have everything that I want, and they also don't have. I prefer this to say big B bug rather than a little B bug. I know it's silly, but I prefer it to be big B. And I prefer to have it as feature rather than enhancement. Or I want to have an improvement label rather than enhancement. So it's very, very much my own convention. I want these labels to be different, right? So and the first time I started doing this, I would then go and manually delete all these. I would add new labels, but I don't do that anymore. I have another tool that does that work for me. But before we get to that, let's get this let's get this to a point where we have the header develop with the recent changes. So I'm going to do a git fetch upstream, and I'm going to fetch the merge request that we put into there. I'm going to rebase my head of my develop with the upstream develop, which will bring in that, and then push that to the origin, and we're ready to go. Okay, so I want to change those labels. and that I have a task within Cake.Recipe that will do that work for me. So if I do build.ps1 and I use a target of labels, I think. What that will do is it will use a tool known as GitReleaseManager. So GitReleaseManager is a utility tool that works with GitHub, and it controls things to do with the actual release. And that includes creating a release, publishing a release, adding assets to a release, and in this case, actually working with the default labels that are available on our repository. So what this has done, as necessary credentials are not available. No, they should be, because I added them in. Why did that not work? Let me just do a quick check here. GitHub username? Is that what it's called? I expected that to work. Give me a second until I check something. Source, tools, Cake.Recipe, content, environment, GitHub username. Did I not close and open the PowerShell window? I must not have. So let's close that a second. And then let's open a new one. And let's just do that again. Is that not working? Let me just check something here. I thought I added the environment variables that I need, but I clearly haven't. Okay, so I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this because I need to do this in a way that you guys can't see my token. So let me go over here. I'll just talk through what I'm doing. So I'm going to go into the settings on Appveyor, and I'm going to pull those environment variables from there and add them into my local environment so that I can run that as part of the local build. I'm almost convinced I did that before I started the stream, but obviously I didn't. So I'm copying the username that I'm going to use into there, and then I'm going to copy the password that I'm going to use into here. Save that. I'm going to save that, and let's just check to see if that's worked. Close that. Baker's Sandbox. Actually, no, Kim, I didn't. I thought I'd taken the I thought I'd added the sandbox right after I added the environment variables, but I don't know what to say there. Okay, better. Right. So let's go back to here, and let's do .NET version Detector again. Right, so we've got a new PowerShell window, so let's add that back on so that you guys can see what I'm doing again. So I'm going to cd into C, GitHub, organizations, Cake.Contrib, Cake.NET version Detector, and if I do .NET build again with target of labels, it should hopefully work this time. So all I've done, to reiterate, I have added 2 environment variables that GitReleaseManager needs in order to do stuff to the GitHub repository on my behalf. So I've just given it essentially my API token, or to make it able to have access to what it needs to do. So create default labels. There we go. Beautiful. So now if we go back to GitHub, so these are the default labels that GitHub provides. But if I refresh this after running the task that I just executed, then now it's got the default labels that I want. So this is purely my way of doing things, but I prefer it to be written in such a way that this one. So the two that stand out here as good first issue and help wanted, they're not in the same case that I would normally have an issue label. But what I didn't know is these are two labels that are used by other external processes in terms of marking issues on a repository as being good for first-time contributors and so on. So I didn't want to mess with any of those, so I've left them as the default. So good first issue and help wanted are the two exceptions to how I typically label my issues. So what I can do now is I can go in here and I can label them. So I can label these with, so this one is the ability to execute .NET version detector. That to me is a feature. I'm going to label that with feature. This one is a related to build. So I'm going to label that. That's me doing stuff to the build to make it work. So I'm just going to label that with build. And this one also is a build task. I'm going to label that as build. So now that I have my issues identified, I have commits against each of those issues to say what I was doing and why. I've got that closed loop of issues to labels to code commits. What I want to do now is I want to create a milestone, and that milestone is a collection of issues that will ultimately go into my final release. So what we saw down here when we did this build is that thanks to GitVersion, which I'm running on this repository, I know that I'm working towards the 0.1.0 release of this application. Now, I could work towards a 1.0.0 release. I tend not to do that. I tend to start with a 0.1.0 and then build from there once I've kind of flushed out the API to a point that I'm happy with it, and then I'll publish 1.0.0. So in order to capture those, I want to create a milestone. So I want to create a milestone that has the version number that I'm working towards. So in this case, I'm going to create a milestone with 0.1.0. Okay. And if I go back to my issues, I can then associate each of these issues with that milestone so that I'm working towards that. Now, a good example of how this then gets built up is if I go to the Cake repository, which is cake build cake, then you can see how these milestones kind of develop over time. So there's much more issues in this repository, but if we look at the milestones, then we can see that in the next release of Cake, which is the 0.3.3, then we're working towards, there are 4 open issues and there are 3 closed ones, but there are also some issues that have been allocated post or towards the 1.0 release of Cake. So these are further out issues that we know or take a little bit of time or are not going to be required until that release further down the line. So it's a good way of kind of providing a kind of a roadmap to what's going into a release and when people can expect things to be shipped. So I, for one, make extensive use of milestones in all the projects that I work with, but that's just the way I work. Again, this is my convention, this is my way of doing things, take it or leave it. Okay, so now that I've got that part done, I mentioned right at the start, I follow Git flow. So in order to go from my develop branch to my master branch, I would create a release branch. And if I follow the conventions of Git flow, which would be to create a new branch, Git branch -b. No, that's not what I want to do though. I want to git checkout -b, a release branch called 0.1.0 from the develop branch. So what we're doing here is we're following the Git flow best practices, which is to create a release branch with the name of the release that we're going forward. So now that we're on there, this is where we would do ideally some sort of QA. We would be doing bug fixes if there are any things that are identified. We wouldn't be pulling in any new features at this point. We'd only be working on fixing what's gone into this release so far. But now that we're here, I can use GitReleaseManager to generate myself a set of release notes. So if I run a build with the target of release notes, what that's going to do is it's going to use the asserted version number that comes from GitVersion, which is 010, and it's going to look in GitHub for a milestone with that same version number, and it's going to take any issues that have been allocated to that milestone and use the title of that issue or PR and generate a set of release notes. Now, if we go over here and then look at releases, there's 0 releases, but what we've got is a draft version that doesn't have anything in it. Why does that not have anything in it? Oh, that's annoying, because the issues are open. Oh my goodness. I'm so glad that Kim is on the call tonight. Thank you very much. Right. So, GitReleaseManager only works with closed issues. So if an issue isn't closed, it won't add it into the release notes. So Kim is absolutely correct in what he said there. So I'm essentially done with all of these. So I'm going to mark them as closed, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the releases section and I'm going to discard this draft because I don't want it anymore. And I'm going to run that build again, or that target again. So now it's going to look for all of those closed issues, thank you, Kim, and it's going to generate the release notes from, again, the header, the title of those issues, and generate the release notes from there. So what we should see this time is a successful build. Thank you. And if we go back to here and look at releases, now we've got some release notes. This is looking better. So what it's saying, as part of this release, we had 3 issues closed, and if I click on that, I can look at the milestone. It's showing me all those closed issues, but what it's not showing me is the titles of the 2 other issues. So that's that I expected. If we go back to Visual Studio Code and we look at the GitReleaseManager.yaml file I added earlier, then I've got some configuration in here that says these are the labels of issues that I want to include in my release notes, but these are ones that I don't want to include. So anything that is a build task or a build issue is not something that I necessarily want to add into my release notes, because that's kind of that doesn't add anything to the end user of this add-in. They don't care that I've modified something in the build process. They just care that there's a new feature or a new improvement or a new bug being fixed. So Git Release Manager is correctly identifying that there were 3 issues closed as part of this build, part of this release, but it's only added a entry for the feature, the one feature that was added, and that's absolutely what I want. Okay, so with that done, I can go back to here and I can say git checkout master, and I can do a git merge OFF in from, that didn't work. I don't have a master, sorry, git checkout PSB of master from origin master. What's that saying? That's fine. So now I do a git merge NoFF from my release branch, and then I can say git. So now I'm at a point I've brought all of that code from my develop branch through the release branch into my master branch, ready for deployment. Now if I say I git push upstream at this point, I'm going to take that master branch and push it to upstream, which will kick off an Appveyor build. And then I'm going to do a git push origin, just so that everything's synced up. Now over here in my Appveyor build, it's got that build. It's now going to execute that build. Now, what this is not going to do is this is not actually going to deploy anything to NuGet. Now, the reason it's not going to do that is because the way that Cake.Recipe works is that Cake.Recipe will only do a deployment to NuGet, which is the final destination for the build, if that build is tagged. Now, the build that we were executing here is not a tagged build. It is on the master branch, so it may or may not do other things that a build on the develop branch would have done or wouldn't do, but it's not going to do the final deployment step. The final deployment step will only happen once a tag has been associated with on the master branch. Now, arguably, there is a repetition of the build at that point. So technically, I'm duplicating a build and generating assets for the exact same code. The underlying code within the master branch isn't changing, so technically you could argue that there's a duplication of effort there, and what I should be doing is I should just be, if on the tag, on the tagged build, I should only be pushing the assets that were generated as part of the previous build step, or the previous build. Absolutely correct. I haven't quite settled on a way that I like for that to happen. If I was using something like Team City, then that's a lot easier in terms of chain builds happening between dependencies of one build to another one is a lot easier in something like Team City. There is a way of doing it in Appveyor, but I haven't settled on a way that I'm happy with. So for now, I'm happy to do the build again when the tag is applied. So it's also a kind of a sanity check. The final merge into the master branch may cause some issues because it might be running steps that weren't run otherwise. So for me, it's a final good sanity check just to make sure that things are working the way I want them to. And assuming that this build passes, what I'm then going to do is I am going to go into this release that was created on GitHub, and I'm going to say publish release. And the act of pushing that green button there is it's going to add a tag to the GitHub repository on the master branch with the name of the milestone, which in this case was 010. And then that will then send another build to Appveyor to then actually run the final build, which will then result in the publishing of the NuGet package to NuGet.org. So let's just wait and see if all of that works. I'm going to wait for this build to finish and then I'm going to click on the release. So are there any questions from anyone that's still in the chat room about anything that's been talked about today? Because this is really the final step. If all of this works, we are going to get a NuGet package that's ready for consumption. And what we should also get is some announcements happening. So the final thing that Cake.Recipe does is it will notify Twitter, and it will send a message into a Gitter room to say that a new release of the add-in is ready. So if we go over here to gitter.im/ what is it? Cake.Contrib lobby, I want to say. Not Luby, that won't work. Close. So what we should find is that we will get a notification sent into there. And if we go into twitter.com/cake.contrib, it's not Cake.Contrib, what is it? It is that's all one word. It's not Cake.Contrib. So in order to announce to people that a new version of an add-in is ready, Cake.Recipe takes care of that for us as well. So that build succeeded and everything happened the way I wanted it to. So you'll notice here that it didn't push a final package to myget, and that's also expected because myget is really just for the pre-release versions. So it's not. I wouldn't push the final version to myget. So what we should find up in myget skipping that task because it's on the master branch. It doesn't need to push that final version to my Git because it knows it's going to go to NuGet. So that was good. So I'm going to go and click ahead and click Publish Release. So if we scroll to the top here and look at the history, the difference between the build that's away to happen is it's building the exact same commit, but the difference this time around is that this tag is applied here. So as a result of that tag being applied, Cake.Recipe takes a slightly different path through the build script, and the end result will be that rather than skipping the NuGet task to publish, it will actually publish it to NuGet. So again, we're waiting on the build happening. So part of me is thankful that Pascal is in the chat room tonight, because one of the issues that we do run into on Cake.Contrib Appveyor account is that we only have one consecutive build, one concurrent build allowed on the project because we're using the open source version. So when Pascal's busy on working on his projects, there can be a slight queue of issues, a queue of builds happening here. So thankfully he's in this chat room and he's not doing active work on Cake.Contrib at the minute, and my builds have been running when I want them to, as opposed to being queued up behind some of his. That's one of the benefits, if you like, of the Azure DevOps offering, where you can get 10 concurrent builds happening on your projects rather than the one that Appveyor offers. Yeah. And Pascal's just giving me an evil smiley in the chat room. So he's listening as well. That's good. So let's see where it's getting to. So it's getting to Duke Finder. So it's still going through all the same processes. It doesn't skip anything that would otherwise be done. Yes, that's true. Pascal, similar to Kim that I mentioned earlier. So both Kim and Pascal are users of Cake.Recipe, and both have been active contributors to where it is today. So again, thankful to both of them for the work that they put in bringing us all together. Perfect, love it. So even though we're running the kind of the final build, this is kind of where some optimizations could be made in this final step. Rather than running all of these things which we know have just happened and succeeded successfully, there's little point in actually building them again. But that's the kind of the trade-off that I have in the workflow that I currently optimize or currently use within Cake.Recipe. So let's just see how far out we are. So let's look at the history of this one. And it was 3 minutes 45, so we've got about another minute for the build, and we should be at a point. At that point, we should have a new NuGet package, and we should see a tweet and a Gitter message being posted, so to let everyone know about it. So let's just see if we get to that point. Fingers crossed this is going to work. If there are any questions, now would be the time to ask them about anything that we've been discussing on this live stream. We're getting there, so it's just about to do the unit tests. Once the unit tests are done, it will likely run YAM again, just as a final push of the documentation. But the YAM step is kind of clever enough to know that as a result of the generate documentation, nothing's actually changed between the last build, so it won't actually push any changes to the GitHub repository into that GitHub Pages branch. It'll identify that there are no changes to the generate documentation, and it won't do the commit. Curious if you make a tag from a release branch, aka a pre-release, would it work the same as with a tag from the master branch? I'm going to let Pascal answer that one because I know for a fact that he does that. He can probably provide some more details as to that question. The short answer is yes, you can. If you tag a release branch, it will generate a -beta in the package version, which will then result in a push to NuGet. Yes, it will. Another question there was, is there a MyGet feed for pre-release builds of Cake itself? Absolutely, absolutely there is. I think that's documented on the repository, but if I just go in here again, would it sign me out? No, it hasn't. So here. So Cake build Cake. So the feed details are available here. Copy, and I can paste that into the chat room here. Yeah. So that's the MyGet feed for Cake itself. So if I look at the packages on this feed, then here's Cake, and you'll find the most recent build off of the develop branch, which was today actually. So there's a alpha version 16 on the MyGet feed ready for consumption. So all you need to do is alter your either, depending on how you do it, depending how you're downloading that Cake packages into your build process, likely a slight modification to the Bootstrapper to specify the source location to get that Cake package from, rather than from NuGet. So where do we get to? So it's now at the point of running YAM. So I think Twitfool there is Gitfool on GitHub. I think I see what you're doing with your naming conventions that you use. It is you. Perfect. Thank you for your contributions recently into Cake, by the way. You've been, I know you've been keeping Matthias busy with some pull request reviews. That's ideal. I don't know. I don't know, Kim. So there's documentation being generated. So the final step now should be the after the cover all stuff should actually be to generate a NuGet package and push it out. So let's see if this part works. Kind of the pièce de résistance, as they say. There we go. So it worked. So if we go over to here, then we can see that there's a message added into this Gitter room which says version 010 of Cake.Net version Detector Addin has just been released, and you can find it here. It's a slight lie because if we go to this link, then it won't be there because the NuGet.org package index needs to be updated to indicate or to add it into the feed. So it's a slight lie, but the fact that the build was successful means that the push to NuGet.org did happen, and as a result, the tweet and the tweet went out. So you'll see a tweet here that says version 010 of Cake.Net version Detector Addin has been released, and I think there's a follow-up message from Kim there to say that it worked, which it did. So in theory, once the package indexing kicks in, this will work. But what we can do is if I go over to here and sign in with the Cake Contrib account. So Cake, let me just find the username and password that I want here. Cake-contrib @.com. And I paste the password in, and I think I've got two-factor authentication in. I can't remember whether that's a good thing or a bad thing to show to people, so I'm just going to hide that. So where's the two-factor authentication? that one. That's not. Put that back on. So yeah, it is there because I'm now signed in as the Cake.Contrib user, but it's still validating and indexing that package. So it won't be available for consumption on NuGet.org until this process has happened. But the fact that it's gotten to this point, it doesn't normally take long to then make it available on the feed. So hopefully this has been a useful introduction into what Cake.Recipe is and the CI/CD pipeline that you can put in place for the repositories that you're using it with. As I mentioned, this is pretty much the process that I use for any project that I'm working on now, and there's a few of them. So you'll have seen in my that number is quite scary sometimes when you look at it. But yes, almost all of the repositories that have any sort of .NET component in it, I use Cake.Recipe where I can, because it, like I say, it means reusing those scripts again and again and again, and I get a consistent build infrastructure that I'm familiar with across all of those projects. So that, as they say, is that. If there are any questions, feel free to reach out. This video will be making its way onto YouTube once I do the upload. One thing that I will point out is that I do have a repository here for these live streams that I'm doing. So if there is, or if there are any particular topics that you would like me to cover and you think I would be able to help with those, feel free to add an issue into this repository. This is kind of what I'm using for kind of capturing ideas that I have that will make a good Twitch stream. But if there is anything, I can close that one because I did that one. I can close that issue because I did a stream on that. That was the last stream that I did. Feel free to add an issue into here, and I can take that on board and run with that. The next stream that I am planning is one for next Monday, which was going to be, the topic is going to be getting started doing some coding on Chocolatey project. So Chocolatey project is the other project that I work on. So what I'm going to work through in that stream is getting an environment set up ready for contributing code to the Chocolatey project. And the first kind of task that I'm going to be looking at is how to add a new command into the Chocolatey CLI to do some work. So one of the things that's missing at the minute from the Chocolatey CLI is the ability to export the currently installed packages on your machine into a usable format. So I'm going to look into how we can go about adding a command into the Chocolatey CLI to add a new export command that will allow us to generate a packages.config file that contains all the packages that are currently installed. So I'm going to walk through going from a base VM that has nothing on it up to the Chocolatey codebase being compiled, and then starting to construct a pull request that adds in that functionality. So that's kind of what I'm going to be looking at next. So if that's of any interest to you, feel free to jump in. If not, if there's something specifically you want me to look at, feel free to add it into this issue here. For now, I'm going to sign off, and I'm going to go to bed because it's almost past my bedtime. So thank you very much for coming along, and I will talk to you all soon, hopefully. Thank you very much.